Hello, and welcome back to our weekly live stream. This is the live stream where we take your questions at the 11th hour. And, well, the reason is because yesterday, which is normally, well, I shouldn't say normally, there's nothing normal about my days off, but I had a day off yesterday, and I did a live stream conversation with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy on Explain International's channels. So that was a very interesting conversation, and it's always great to be able to talk to Michael. So the format of today will be exactly the same as always, where we take your questions for an hour and a half. The only difference is that the time is after I've come home from work. So if I'm a little more sluggish than normal, or a little more, let's say, not so quick as I normally am, understand that I've had a full day of work. I'm tired, and I haven't had any popcorn. So, you know, I have to deal with what I've got, which is no popcorn. But a popcorn video is coming soon, and some of you might have already seen the YouTube listing for the premiere. So not this Monday, but next Monday, we're having another popcorn video. So stay tuned, and I hope you can join us for that. So with that said, let's get into the questions. And our first question, super chat, is from Mouthwash for 30 Israeli shekels. Thank you very much. And he says the songs of Miriam and Deborah are in an older Hebrew than the rest of the Tanakh. Is this an altered Hebrew of the 11th century? Can you describe the language evolution and the updating of the text? Okay. Now, one of the things that we have to be careful of here is that, while most scholars do think that, say, Judges chapter 5 is older than Judges chapter 4, nobody can really prove that. Okay? And we have to be very, very honest about that. Proof of one chapter being the older has sort of defied scholarship. So while most scholars think that the poetic sections are older, the evidence isn't there. And we have to be really, really careful when we start comparing poetics and prose and try to evaluate the age. Now, I know the thinking of liberal scholars here is that it's poetry, therefore that's the oldest form, that's the oral form, that's the nascent form. But we don't see this in other ancient Near Eastern literature. We don't see this, for example, in Egypt. In Egypt, there can be mixed genres with, say, the poetic form looking older, but we know it's dated to the exact same period of time. And we find this like on the Merneptah stela. So it's a very, very tricky thing to try to date poetry. Really, really tricky. And I would defy most scholars to give a really coherent answer to that second question to try to describe the language evolution, and particularly in the updating of the text. Now, we do know that Hebrew has been updated over time. Its vowel forms have been updated. We know that, say, vocabulary moves in time. Words change their meaning over time. And a great example of this is suf and sof. Suf, meaning reeds, is an Egyptian loan word. But sof doesn't come into the language until, say, Middle Hebrew of the 8th and 9th centuries BC. So we do have examples where the language does become updated over time. Okay? But it's really, really tricky when we start talking about, say, Deborah. That's really, really tricky. And part of the problem is we don't have a baseline. We don't have a really good baseline here to compare it to. Now, when you look at, say, the Hebrew of the Judges, it's not that dissimilar from the Hebrew of the Torah or the Pentateuch. Okay? But it does differ, say, slightly from, say, the Hebrew of, say, the later periods, the, say, the divided monarchy. So there is a difference between the two. But it's a slight difference, and it's really hard to judge which text is actually older. And I know that, again, most scholars here are going to go on gut feeling. I prefer evidence. So to answer this question fully, I'm going to have to say, I don't know. I don't know which text is older. They might be the same. One might be older, one might not be. It's virtually impossible to tell. Especially given, say, the idiosyncrasies we find between poetic and prose we find in other ancient Near Eastern literature. So, with that said, thank you very much for your super chat. And it's a great question. It's a good question. It's a question that's worth engaging and answering. So, mouthwash for another 6 shekels. Okay. Fringe history views you hold or think plausible. Well, I'm not a fringe historian. I know a lot of people want to shoehorn me and call me a fringe, but I'm really not a fringe historian. So, I know it sounds really boring, but I'm actually a very conventional historian. I tend to follow consensus history most of the time. It's only in some sort of minor areas where I will take even a minority view. I mean, I have to take a minority view on biblical maximalism versus biblical minimalism, but that's because the evidence is there. Most of what I follow is really evidence driven. And the problem with fringe history is most of those views are not driven by data. They're not driven by evidence. They're driven by hypotheticals or suppositions or logical fallacies. And my training has just been too good for me to sort of, even go on to, say, alluring speculation. Interesting speculation really doesn't even hold a lot for me. Now, with that said, there's a lot of French history views I think are interesting. Okay, but that's not the same as thinking they're plausible. I mean, I love the whole fringe chronology thing, but I like it because it's for me, studying the way they think. I also happen to like new religious movements for much the same reason, which is they present an interesting way of how they got to where their religious beliefs are. But I don't think it's plausible religiously, just like I don't think French history is plausible historically. So, I'm gonna kind of have to disappoint you on this one, because there's really not many. I can't think of a French history view that I would, throw my support behind. I'm a lot more conventional than, say, Michael Heisner on this. So, and I know where he throws his support sometimes on these views. Anyway, I'm a lot less daring. I'm a timid scholar. I'm a very timid scholar. So, yeah, none of you will believe in that, but yes, I'm actually a timid scholar. I don't say much when I go to academic conferences. I'm very rarely will raise my hand and ask a question. It's just I'm not that outspoken, except on YouTube for some reason. But there it is. Anyway, thank you for your super chat. It was an interesting question, but I'm sorry that it's not more to your liking. Okay. Now the super chat from Disciple of Christ for $5. Thank you very much. Do you ever think we will ever find evidence for a historical Moses outside of the Bible? My guess is probably not. And the reason why we probably won't find it is because I think his mother was not the daughter of Pharaoh until after he left. Okay. I think that his adopted mother was part of the Ramesside clan. And as a result of being part of the Ramesside clan, he had already run into exile by the time that the Ramessides ascended the throne. So I don't think he had any dedication stela. I don't think there was any inscriptions with his name on it. I'd be very, very surprised if we find any evidence at all for Moses. Now, on the other hand, I do think at some point we are going to find something for Joseph with his Egyptian name, Zapana Paneach. You know, I think we will find that eventually. And that's because he held a high enough rank in Egypt where he would be having dedication stela and mortuary statues. So I think it's just a matter of time before we find something for Joseph. Okay. But I don't think we're going to find anything for Moses. He just wasn't high enough in rank. With it, his status was just too low when he left Egypt. So I'd be satisfied with just having something for Joseph. If we have something for Joseph, then we can probably infer the rest of it. But I think that's the best we can expect. Thank you very much for the question and the super chat. Okay. Tyler McKaylee. No popcorn. No. Yeah, no popcorn. How am I going to keep energized to the entire live stream? Okay. Josh Skesho for $20. Thank you very much. A very generous super chat. Are there any other plausible parties that could be responsible at all for the late Bronze Age destruction of both Jericho and its walls, or are Joshua and the Israelites truly the only possible explanation? Okay. I don't think they're the only truly plausible explanation, but I think the options are really limited. Okay. At this point in time, the Hittites are not on the horizon. The Mitanni Empire has been completely destroyed. The only real major superpower left is Egypt, and at that point in time, Ramses II is no longer campaigning. He has his last campaign in his 18th regnal year. So that's long before the destruction of Jericho. So it wasn't destroyed by the Egyptians. So what that leaves is essentially either the Israelites or destruction by another city-state in the Levant. And that's always a possibility. It could have been destroyed by one of Jericho's neighbors. Possible. And certainly can't be ruled out. But that would be probably your only alternative option is probably one of the other city-states in the Levant. But I think all the major powers are accounted for at this point that we can rule out at least major powers destroying Jericho. So after that, that leaves you with the Israelites, and it leaves you with, say, another city-state in the Judean foothills, most likely, where we find Jericho. So that's sort of the parameters we're working with here. So the question is, were any of Jericho's neighbors strong enough to do this? Now, that's a different question. That's a different question. And it doesn't actually seem likely given the depopulation. The Levant went through a period of depopulation. Essentially from the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze Age, the population of the city-states in the Levant slowly declined. So you only had like a few hundred people, like, you know, manning each city. So, and we don't know exactly the reason why the Levant underwent this depopulation, but it did. So the question is, were any of Jericho's neighbors strong enough to repel an invasion? Really difficult to say, but it doesn't seem very likely. So if you eliminate, say, the major powers, you look at the probability of being one of Jericho's, you know, neighboring city-states, which seems not very likely. That does sort of lead you to one last alternative, which is the Israelites. So it does come down to a probabilistic explanation, probabilistic calculation. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat, and I hope that answered your question. Okay. Disciple of Christ for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think the Septuagint is representative of an older Hebrew text? Yes. It's definitely an older Hebrew text than the Masoretic. Do you think that then it would be closer to the originals than the Masoretic text? Now, this is where things get really interesting. I've done a lot of lower text criticism. I pretty much do it, you know, every time I have to do a major piece of biblical work. And you're often ended up, you know, looking at, you're comparing the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then usually something from the Dead Sea Scrolls, if a Dead Sea Scroll is available, because it's not extant for everything. There's also some minor other texts too. There's one from the Wadi Mirabat as well, you know, so there's a few minor texts as well you can compare. You can even compare, say, Targum. But the process of lower text criticism has indicated that there isn't one text that's closest to the original. And this is a really hard concept to sort of get your head around, because you'd think Septuagint comes from a text that, you know, dates roughly to 250 BC. It's got to be closer to the original than the Masoretic text. And the answer is, well, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And one of the sort of frustrating things about lower text criticism is you can't really say which corpus is going to be closest to the original. You have to take each Bible verse on a case-by-case basis. And it's a lot of work, because you're comparing every Bible verse to every other extant text family that's available, and then you have to make that judgment of what's the original reading. And only then, for that particular verse, can you decide which one is closest to the original Hebrew. And 99% of the time, comparing just the 3 or 4 sources we have will be enough to tell you which one is the original or closest to the original. Because it's really obvious once you start working with these, you know, which way it's going to go. So it's not a blanket answer. You know, I just can't say the Septuagint is older. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have been very, very helpful in this regard and have thrown us some real surprises. You know, like, for example, the height of Goliath. You know, in the Septuagint, I think it says 6 cubits, and I think in the Masoretic text it says 4. You know, and scholars always thought that the Masoretic text was the original reading and the Septuagint was the inflated reading, you know, the changed, altered reading. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls come along and peg Goliath's height at 6 cubits. So the original reading is 6 cubits, which is really not what scholars expected out of this. So there's some really interesting stuff that's come out of this, but it is very much a case-by-case basis. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. An interesting question. Okay, super chat from Fencing Mitch for $5 Australian. Thank you very much. Left field. Ooh. Well, I love left field questions. It means I can speculate without actually knowing what I'm talking about. What's your opinion on the Trojans being the sea peoples after Troy? Yes. I don't have a problem with that. I think the Trojans were very, very much. Well, I don't think the Trojans were the sea peoples. Okay, I think that the Trojans were put on the defensive by the sea peoples. I think the sea peoples were, in many respects, Greek-speaking people who had come in and tried to conquer Troy, because what we have, say, of the fall of the Hittite New Kingdom is the sea people driving them out from the west, where they're having to consolidate their lands. Now let me finish the rest of the question here, because you got me going here. Or being the Romans. Okay. I don't think the sea peoples are Romans. I do think they're Greeks. Just want a reason to support your work. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We always need more support. This is very difficult work, and there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's very, very difficult to do this kind of work. So your support means so much to us, because it validates what we do. And thank you for that super chat. But yeah, I think the sea peoples are Greeks. And they're Anatolian Greeks. They're Greeks that settled into Anatolia, which is Turkey. They start picking up the local languages, and then they start moving southward. And that's sort of the origin of the sea peoples. It's also ultimately the origin of the Philistine too, because the Philistines come from that line of people. So. Interesting question, even if out of left field. Thank you very much. Very much appreciated. Okay. Charles for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is there evidence of a 7-year famine in Egypt? Would this help to date the Exodus? Okay. There is evidence of extended famines in Egypt. And that's why it doesn't help us to date the Exodus. We do have recorded in Egypt periodic famines that happen from time to time. All the way back to the Old Kingdom, all the way through to the Ptolemaic period, Egypt has recorded famines. And we find these recorded in the Nilometer readings. Now, what a Nilometer is it's a great kind of pit on the edge of the river that floods to a certain level. And the Egyptians use this to calculate taxation. So if it's a high flood, they expect a bumper crop, and they're going to tax you heavily. If it's a low Nile flood, it pretty much means starvation, and no one's going to get much taxed. So what we have here is those records were kept, sometimes better than others, but unfortunately it doesn't help us date the Exodus, because famine and drought were actually so common that, you know, even if we could say one was but we had a famine in a certain year, it wouldn't actually help us to pinpoint it down. it happened often enough that it's really not a useful data point. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very interesting question. Okay. Moises Salazar for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hello, Dr. Falk. If there is some legacy from Gölbekli Tepe and Katel Hayu in the ancient Middle East, like the exhumation of human bodies, could be seen as predecessor of resurrection beliefs. Wow. Well, Gölbekli Tepe is a very old site. I mean, it's the oldest temple site that's been discovered. You know, I mean, I think they're dating that now. And I'm no expert on this. Okay, I'm gonna say straight up, I'm no expert on Gölbekli Tepe. I have a very good friend who is. I have a very good friend who knows this site inside and out. I am not the expert on this, so I'm going to have to admit my ignorance here. But I've heard it bandied around something like 10, 12,000 years old, something like that. And that could be completely wrong, okay? But I've heard a lot of very big numbers thrown around for that site. So the thing is, what we have there is we have this temple with pillars and animal reliefs on the pillars. So it's really hard without, say, language, recorded language, to figure out exactly what the beliefs are. So could there be a predecessor to resurrection beliefs? Yeah, possibly. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I also would think, though, that resurrection beliefs are part of the human condition as well. You know, the fact is that we, as human beings, have this unique capability that we can imagine a future. You know, we can remember the past, but we can also imagine a future. And that's how we sort of get forward thinking. So the idea that we can, you know, imagine a future where we live again after death is something that's, say, common to all humanity. And I think that's sort of something that's been instilled into us by God. That God has given us this ability to consider our death and what comes after our death. So it wouldn't surprise me that you know, you'd find those beliefs at, say, Gölbekli Tepe. But it's hard to say exactly what their beliefs are without written language. But it's plausible. I'll definitely give you that. It's definitely plausible. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Finding Truth for $5. Good to see you, my friend. My good friend Santi. Does the Exodus point towards an early date for the Pentateuch? Yes, it does. Part of it is because when we look at, say, the itinerary of the Pentateuch, all the details of the Pentateuch, you know, it does actually seem to point to an early writing as well. We also have a lot of Egyptian vocabulary, Egyptian names, Egyptian customs, you know, customs that can't be explained by the Pentateuch being written hundreds of years later. You know, such as memory of the really obscure places. You know, like you know, I was telling one of somebody on YouTube today. You know, Pihahirot is an incredibly obscure place. We only have 2 references to it in the ancient Near East. One is in Papyrus Anastasi 3, which dates to Merneptah. The other is the Book of Exodus. Those are the only 2 mentions of Pihahirot. And it's a really obscure town on the southern coast of the Plusiak estuary. You know, it's not on a major road. You know, you'd almost have to have gone by it to even notice it. So, it's not something that would have transcended into, say, oral tradition or oral memory, because it was just so minor, and it plays such a small part of the story. So when you start incorporating details like that, you know, details like the Israelite women putting the bread bowls in the garments of their shoulder, you know, this is not something they did in the Levant. This is something that was only done in Egypt. And that's because of the unique shape of bread bowls, which were these tall cylinders. It was Egyptian practice to put tall cylindrical objects in this sort of scarf that you wore around your shoulders. So, you know, when you start looking at details like that and seeing that all these sorts of things are unique to Egypt, you know, yeah, it sort of does lend credence to an early date. And of course, you can't overlook the loanwords, you know, because loanwords are definitely dateable as well, you know, and we have loanwords that sort of stop at we have Egyptian loanwords that are late Egyptian. So, you know, there's a point in time where we see those loanwords sort of, you know, ossified. They freeze in time. You know, somebody wrote it down at a particular point when, say, Egyptian was in that phase of development, but didn't go beyond it. Like, we don't find late Egyptian, or sorry, third intermediate period style Egyptian in the Pentateuch. So I do think it does very much help to narrow down the dating of the documents themselves. So my thoughts on about the House of Kettle.
Somebody said
kettle corn. Oh, too much sugar. Habanero corn. Okay, now we're talking. But the House of Kettle, yeah. I know you're trying to get a rise out of me with that one. No, I don't think the Teldan Stela reads a House of Kettle. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. You got my opinion, though, on that yesterday. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Gizgo SBOL for $5. Thank you very much. I know I butchered that. I'm sorry. What evidence supports Joseph in Egypt during the 15th rather than the 12th dynasty? And can we be certain that there were no chariots during the 12th dynasty? Okay, there's a couple reasons why chariot armies were not used in the 12th dynasty. Okay. First of all, the kings of the 12th dynasty did not have a horse breeding program. You need horses of a certain type to pull chariots. And there was an excellent book done on this, which lays out the sort of the development of the horse or the breeding of the horse in Egypt. You know, so, you know, there might have been one or two examples of a chariot that was imported from the Levant into Egypt, but they would have had to import the horses with it. That's not plausible when you have to start making an army. Okay? If you're using chariots in warfare, which is practically what they're used for. They're not go-karts. They're not joyriding vehicles. They're weapons of war. Okay? You have to have them done in a way that's accessible to your armed forces. You can't import enough horses to make a large standing army out of that. Not unless you start instituting a breeding program of your own. And the kings of the 12th dynasty just didn't do this. Okay. Furthermore, we do have lots of reliefs of warfare from the Middle Kingdom. They're plentiful. It's actually one of the few times in Egyptian history where we do have lots and lots of pictorial evidence. And the tombs of Beni Hassan are just full of warfare reliefs. So we've got actually a lot of positive evidence that shows us what warfare looked like in the Middle Kingdom. So I think we can really rule out the idea that the chariot was part of, say, Middle Kingdom warfare. Now, we also find in the 15th dynasty, one thing we don't find in the 12th dynasty is the beginning of horse burials. At Avaris, we find several horses that were buried. So that does seem to indicate that they're no longer using at least the 15th dynasty is not using the Egyptian native wild horse without at least some mixing of the gene pool from, say, Levantine horses. And that was pretty common to do, which was to bring horse riding stock from the Levant to sort of freshen up the gene pool. So this first first attempt to sort of interbreed the wild horse and the Levantine horse created a very, very strong type of horse that was able to pull a chariot. We also see at this time too the bridle and the bit become extant as well in Egypt. These are our earliest examples of bridles and bits also come from Avaris, and that's because the Hyksos imported a lot of, say, Hurrian, essentially Mitanni horsemen and chariot technology. So I think we got pretty good documentation to say that, Joseph, because of the occurrence of the chariot, has to be 15th dynasty. It can't be 12th. But great super chat. Thank you very much. Hey, Brian Peachy for $5. Thank you very much. Do you think there were two Judean campaigns by Sennacherib? I'm going to have to look into that, honestly. I know we talked about this 2 live streams ago, and I haven't had the time to look at it. And that's because I've been making popcorn videos. So, yeah, that popcorn video took me way too long to make. Yeah, I know I need to look into this. So, why did Rabshakeh show up if Hezekiah paid the tribute and gave all the silver from the temple? Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? This is where the prophecy comes from, where if you sort of resist and don't pay the tribute, Emmanuel, otherwise, your wealth will be carried away, and that's ultimately what happened. Was Hezekiah paid some tribute, had it carried away, and then I think Sennacherib got greedy and came back for more. That's what I think happened. Was that 2 Judean campaigns? Was it one campaign that where Sennacherib wasn't satisfied by the tribute he received? I don't know. I'm going to have to look this one up. I really am. But I will do it, and I will come back, and I'll let you know, okay? But thank you very much for the super chat. I do very much appreciate it. Okay, Bibliotheca Historica for $5. Thank you very much. Which books would you recommend on the history and culture of the Middle Kingdom? Thoughts on the length of Pepi II's reign, 94 years. Okay, I'll take the second one first because that's the easier question. Thoughts on the length of Pepi II's reign is that it is the longest reign in probably of any king in human recorded history. It is very long. He comes to the throne at age 2. And he reigns throughout his entire long life. The reign is well documented. He had lots of courtiers come, go, live, die. Generations knew him. His cartouches everywhere. It's really hard to miss Pepi's Pepi II's influence on Egyptian society. It's also a time when we started also seeing the weakening of the Old Kingdom as well. And that's a problem with long reigns. Exceptionally long reigns lead to weakness in the kingdom because you do need that fresh blood coming in every so often. So we're sort of seeing it in our own time with the British monarchy, with Elizabeth II being on the throne for so long. That royal family has gotten very, very weak as a result of not having enough turnover. So it's a common pattern in human history where when you do get a very long reign, you also have weakness in the kingdom. It also happens after the reign of Ramses II too, where the 19th dynasty starts to weaken because Ramses II reigned for 66 years, an incredibly long reign. But Pepi's reign is just really sort of out of the bounds of what is even normal. So, but it is well documented, it's well established, and very plausible, actually. Which books would you recommend for the history and culture of the Middle Kingdom? I would always start with Ian Shaw's Oxford Handbook of Egyptian History. I think that's a good start for basically any period of Egyptian history. After that, it's going to depend on what you want to specialize in the Middle Kingdom. History and culture, there's not so much done on the Middle Kingdom. You do find a fair amount of works being done on texts. I know Leprechaun did some work on the Middle Kingdom. Was it Quirk also did some books on the Middle Kingdom? So Middle Kingdom's not really my specialty, so I can't give you specific titles. I'm really a New Kingdom guy. I really am into the New Kingdom. So I can't give you a specific recommendation here, but I know that there are people who've been working on this. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very interesting super chat. Okay, C Clock 35 for $5 Canadian. Thank you very much. Recommendations for newbies to Egyptian history, primary texts, general surveys, etc. Okay, the last super chat also applies to you. That Oxford Handbook of Egypt, History of Egypt, is by Ian Shaw. Incredibly good. It's a good primer book. It does need an updating, and I think he is doing a 3rd edition now, so which is good because there has been discoveries that have been done. But it's an excellent book, and I would highly recommend it. So that's the foundation text that, when I do a class, when I do a course on the history of ancient Egypt at a university, that's the recommended textbook. It's great reading at a lay level. A first-year college student can easily handle it. So it's a good text. I very much recommend it. Now, while it's really long in the tooth now, and I wouldn't recommend it for a university anymore, because so much water has gone under the bridge, and it desperately needs update. Barry Kemp's Anatomy of a Civilization was also very good, but you do have to now understand that a lot of time has passed since that book was written, and it didn't age all that well. It's still a good book. It's still a good book, but you can't take everything it says at face value anymore. So I would recommend that with a caution that it desperately needs to be updated. Primary texts. There's lots of good translations of primary texts. William Kelly Simpson's anthology on Egyptian, ancient Egyptian literature is excellent. They're good translations. It's not just the good texts. Her translations are not always that good, though. So there's some good recommendations to at least get you started. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. King in the North for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. What realistic evidence can you see being found in the future that overturns the major scholarly opinion on the Exodus or conquest? Do you see biblical minimalism ever changing their minds? Okay. Hmm. Great questions. I think what's going to happen with we're gonna end up getting more ostraca. We're gonna get more texts because um, you know, we're seeing it coming through at now a steady pace. Okay. I think one of the things we're going to see eventually are more and more figures from, say, the period of the Judges and the Conquest come out. Okay. Exodus, we probably won't see a lot more unless, say, P. Ramses itself is excavated. I think they've pretty much gotten everything out of Avaris that they're going to get. So I don't expect to see. I think if there's one area in, say, Egypt that is going to give us more sort of low hanging fruit on the Exodus, it's going to be the excavations that are currently being done in the Wadi Tumilat. Tel El Rataba and Tel El Maskuta are producing some really interesting stuff. And I can't talk about it because it's not published. I've been shown it, but I can't say anything. And it's yeah, there's some good stuff coming out of there. Some really, really good stuff. Follow a scholar named Rezepa. RZEPA. That scholar is producing some very, very interesting field reports out of Tel El Rataba. Tel El Rataba is Pithom. Okay? So there's some very interesting stuff coming out of the Wadi Tumilat, and I think there's going to be some more discoveries out of the Wadi Tumilat that's going to be game changing. I'd also like to see more stuff done in, say, near Ismailia, but I don't think that's going to happen in the near future, just because it's still sort of a hot zone. But I'd love to see the Sinai sort of settle down a bit, so we can get back to excavating the Sinai. That's fantasy, though. I mean, that's not going to happen until the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS is essentially dealt with. So, I will also say that I think there's going to be some more excavations in we are going to see a lot more work in Israel, say, done in, say, the period of the Middle Bronze Age too, which should give us that Middle Bronze into the Late Bronze Age. I think also now with work that was done by Nigro, showing the site leveling by Late Bronze Age people. I think we're going to start seeing some more reevaluation of reports too, and I think that's going to change some of the game as well. So I anticipate there's going to be a lot of changes, coming in the field. You know, and we have to realize that sort of this swing from complete dominance by biblical minimalism to, say, now being sort of toe to toe with biblical maximalism. This has only been a change that's happened over the last 20, 30 years. It's been very recent. So, you know, things can happen. Things can change overnight. And, you know, all I can say is that more data is going to help clarify the picture one way or the other. Do I see biblical minimalism ever changing their minds? It will really depend upon where those biblical minimalists are located. There are some places where skepticism is just admired and adored, even if it defies common sense, evidence, and reason. You know, it's just some places where, you know, it's just that's where it's desired. You know, and many theological schools in North America love skepticism. They think it's scientific. It's not, but they think it is. So, you know, with that sort of perspective, I don't see them ever changing their minds. But I also do see that, you know, in places like Israel, where minds are already being changed, and potentially even in Europe, we could see some movement there as well. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. I hope that answered the questions. Okay. Josh Sketch Show, again for $20. Thank you very much. What are your opinions on the claim of Joseph's sarcophagus being found and taken from Nablus by Theodosius II? The tomb mentioned is the one near Jacob's well. And also, what is your opinion on Jacob being identified with Yakub Har? Okay. Yakub Har. I don't know the origin of that name. Is that from an Amarna text? I mean, that's not something I'm that familiar with. Okay, so you'll have to tell me a little more about the origin of that name, and I could probably then give you a better opinion on that. As far as Joseph's sarcophagus, okay. It wouldn't have been the original sarcophagus of Joseph anyway, because they brought back out of Egypt his mummy, but not his sarcophagus. They would have left the sarcophagus behind, because it would have been, if it was a true sarcophagus of Egyptian style, it would have been incredibly heavy. So they would have left the original sarcophagus behind and just taken the mummy. Now, if they got into the Holy Land and carved a new sarcophagus for Joseph, it would have been probably a limestone sarcophagus, and who knows when it would have actually been carved. So is it all that archaeologically important that Theodosius II took it? Probably not. That would be my guess. As far as the tomb being Joseph's tomb, there's even a problem there. You know, you start getting the onomastica problem, which I've discussed before, where, say, sort of church and Byzantine traditions, you know, start identifying sites based upon, say, local Jewish legend. And you start running into, say, can you really prove these things? And I've always sort of stayed away from, say, like Abraham's tomb and Joseph's tomb and Absalom's tomb, because they are notoriously unreliable traditions. I want to go on a little more evidence than just a local tradition before I sort of, you know, sign on to a local identification. So, let's see here. I see that Dante's Power mentioned where that name comes from. I'll pin it up for just a moment. Oops. Wrong one. Well, I can get it on here. Hit the wrong one there. Okay. All right. Jacob's name came from a seal ring they found from the Hyksos period. Yeah. I don't think that's enough. Because it's not close enough to what we know as I mean, Jacob Har could be Jacob, but may not be. We do know again that they did recycle names, so I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I'd have to take a closer look into that before I comment any further on that. So, yeah, I'm gonna have to sort of give that one a I don't know until I look into it deeper. But I'd like to know again, what's the dating of that ring? Where was it found? Again, Jacob Har. Again, this would be identification of possibly Jacob, but I don't know. It seems kind of iffy that we would find that, you know. And that would be an identification of, say, the patriarch Jacob. So I'm gonna have to be a little skeptical on this one unless I got some more data and more evidence. But it's a good question. It's worth pursuing. Thank you very much for the super chat. Okay, Disciple of Christ, a super chat for $5. Thank you very much. Did the Egyptians ever undertake expeditions like the Phoenicians? Yes, they did. I even wrote a paper on one of these, a peer-reviewed article on the expedition to Punt, which is an African, one of the countries in Africa, probably modern Sudan. During the reigns of Hatshepsut, and probably before then and after as well. The Egyptians would send trading expeditions down the Red Sea and to the nation of Punt, which was below Cush. Okay? So south of Cush. Okay? And the Egyptians had this kind of trading racket. Okay, and it's probably fair to call it a racket, which was Egypt had the secret of smelting copper. Okay, so what they would do is Egypt would make these bronze tools. They would ship them to Punt, sell the tools for gold and malachite. Now, malachite is essentially a copper alloy. And we find pieces of malachite at like Buhan. That malachite was then returned to Egypt, and they basically smelted it all down to make more tools that they then would ship again to Punt to trade for gold, spices, incense, and all the niceties of life. Okay? So yes, they would go on these trading expeditions, and they did it on a pretty regular cycle. And we only find this sort of trading cycle end around the reign of Ramses III. So, and what I think happened was that the people of Punt got wise. Okay? And they discovered the secret of smelting for themselves. Well, once they had the secret, they didn't need the Egyptians anymore. And I think that brought the trading to an end, as well as much of their prosperity. But yes, they did do trading expeditions just like the Phoenicians did. So, very interesting question. Thank you very much. Okay. King of the North for another $10 super chat. Thank you very much. What is your opinion on why the Sea Peoples were on the move? Why did they migrate to Egypt? Surely they came across many rivers in their journeys. Why such a well-defended target? Okay, in the at Medina Habu, on the Sea Peoples inscription by Ramses III, Ramses III explains why the Sea Peoples attempted to invade Egypt. And that was because of food. Okay. The people in Anatolia and along the coastal plain did not have enough food to sustain themselves. This is why they attempted the invasion of Egypt. It was essentially a food grab. Okay. In fact, the text says that they came to Egypt for the sake of their bellies. Essentially, they were hungry. They were hungry, and they wanted food to eat. And what better place to try to steal food from than, say, the breadbasket of the ancient Near East? And, you know, they're not the only people that tried this. You know, the Libyans tried this too during the reign of Merneptah. Sea Peoples also tried this during the reign of Merneptah. You know, many countries had actually tried to invade Egypt to steal the food. And this is why we do find in, say, Egyptian, say, temples, the king smiting foreigners, and why the king has to come off as a warrior king. And that's to protect Egypt's resources, which, frankly, were just enough to feed their own people, to prevent other people coming in and stealing the food. So that's why they were on the move. And this was particularly exacerbated by, say, the late Bronze Age collapse, which caused starvation all across Turkey. We even have a letter from the Hittite king begging Merneptah for food to feed his people. So we know actually the reason why the Sea Peoples were on the move. So that's actually well established and well recorded history. But thank you very much for your questions. And I'll take that last one too. Why such a well-defended target? Because it also had the greatest payoff. It's a risk-reward proposition. Yeah. Biggest payoff was also the riskiest. So that's why they went for Egypt. Okay. Because Egypt had established agriculture and lots of grain silos. And, very tempting if you're hungry. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. RG Strategy for $5. Thank you very much. Did Amenhotep III refuse a request of a Babylonian king to send one of his daughters to marry the king of Babylon? Yes, I made it to this one. Awesome! Finally! Cool. Glad you're here. Wow. I'm actually really excited you're here. So this is so cool. I'm glad you made it. Yes, we find this in Elamarna, letter 4. The king, and we're not exactly sure it's the king of Babylon, but we pretty much think it's the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon sends a letter to Amenhotep III, basically saying, I sent you treaty wives, but what you sent me was basically saying, no king of Egypt, since time immemorial, has sent one of his daughters to a foreign king. Literally given to another. So it is absolutely true that Amenhotep III and practically every other king in Egypt did not reciprocate treaty wives. Okay, this is a peculiarity of Egypt. Egypt didn't have to send treaty wives, so it usually didn't. Now, the only exception we know in all of history where a king sent a treaty wife was to Solomon. And that was either during the reign of Siamum or Susenes II. But we also have to understand, too, that the Egyptian kingdom at that point was in incredibly dire straits. Okay. The Semendes dynasty of Dynasty 21 was just falling apart. So they were trying to garner support wherever they could. So that's probably the only exception that we know of. And again, that is because the situation was also extraordinary as well. But great question, and it is actually true that Egyptians didn't reciprocate the sending of their daughters as treaty wives. Thank you very much for the super chat. I'm glad you're here. Okay. Jizgo Espoel for $5. How would you refute James and Van der Veen's theory that Zerah the Cushite is Usur-Hau, overseer of the northern lands under Ramses IV? Okay. I haven't actually looked at this per se. Okay. But we also know too that Ramses IV really didn't have Ramses IV is the king that lost it all. And most Egyptologists would say that Ramses IV was the king that sort of had the Egyptian hegemony slip away from him. Like in the first couple years of his reign, it did not take long. You know, he lost both Levant and Kush at roughly the same time. And Egypt never really did gain it back. It never did gain back that hegemony after Ramses IV lost it. Okay. Van der Veen's views are very idiosyncratic. Now, I'm saying that knowing his other views, but not having looked at this particular view per se. So I'm not going to comment on this particular view per se because I haven't looked at it. But having looked at some of his other views, they're very idiosyncratic. They don't follow, say, the orthodoxy of, or say, the conventional thinking of Egyptology. He's got some very, very strange views, and he's very sensitive about those strange, those views being called strange. You would almost have to say, in many respects, they're fringe views, because really, of him and maybe one other person might hold to those views. So, you know, yeah, he's very sensitive to me criticizing him on that. But I think he's also got to man up to and you know, take responsibility for the fact that he's the only one who holds these views. So, I'm not going to say anything more about that because, again, I'm not exactly sure what he means by this, but I'd have to, again, look into this deeper. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, JD Freeze for $5. Thank you very much. On a live stream with IP, you mentioned Genesis may be oral history. It does have the earmarks of oral history. Okay. If Avaris community was polytheistic, who preserved the oral tradition? Sons of Jacob? Yeah, absolutely. You know, Sons of Jacob would have, you know, and we have to realize that even though the Avaris community was polytheistic, the oral tradition of the Book of Genesis does not actually present the patriarchs as being strongly monotheistic. They do, you know, Genesis does present the patriarchs as being polytheists. So, Jacob, you know, his wife, Rebecca, I believe, steals all of Laban's idols. You know, so there is this sort of hint of monotheism that runs through, say, the patriarchs' accounts. And I think there is some, say, supervisory writing when these oral traditions are recorded during the life or shortly thereafter of Moses. Okay, so I do think that, but I also think that the oral history is really not that controversial either. We do see a lot of updating of vocabulary, a lot of retrojection in Genesis that we don't find in the rest of the Pentateuch. So, you know, like for example, you know, Abraham meets the king of Egypt and he's called Pharaoh. Well, that's a retrojected term. That's because the term Pharaoh was not extant until the reign of Tutmosis III. You know, after the Israelites were already in captivity. So I think there is a lot to be said that there is oral tradition in the Book of Genesis. And I don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive either that a polytheist couldn't preserve those narratives as well. I think that's completely consistent with who they were as a people, where they came from, and ultimately where they were going. I think that they could easily have preserved these as sort of the tales of their ancestors without it, say, interfering with their religious practices as polytheists. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, Disciple of Christ for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think there is much more biblically related stuff to be found from the Oxyrhynchus texts? I think they pulled out most of the biblical texts already from Oxyrhynchus, so I don't think we're going to find many more, much more stuff from Oxyrhynchus. Most of that tended to be New Testament documents anyway. There were some Old Testament documents, like copies of the Septuagint. But most of what we find at Oxyrhynchus was New Testament. I do think that they've already pulled out most of the biblical material as soon as they discover it. Most of what what's left at Oxyrhynchus, and there's a lot of it, are receipts, legal documents, wills, stuff that would be really interesting to a scholar, but not so interested to, say, a public that's concerned with biblical texts. They're still publishing volumes on the Oxyrhynchus stuff. You know, I saw a volume come out like just last year on Oxyrhynchus. So they're still publishing this. They'll be publishing this stuff for the next 200 years. It's going to take them a long time to get through all of it. They've got 2 million texts that are still in the vaults. So, you know, this is, and a lot of it is fragmentary too. So that doesn't help. But I think sort of the low-hanging fruit here of biblical related stuff has already been gathered. I think that where there's going to be more interesting stuff is, say, the comparative material of, say, Koine Greek. And that's always been really what's been most interesting about Oxyrhynchus anyway, is what it has shown us about what Koine was as a language. Oxyrhynchus changed everything in biblical interpretation. You know, you look at, say, a lexicon, a pre-Oxyrhynchus lexicon like Little and Scott, and it was made obsolete overnight just by the Oxyrhynchus papyrus. You know, papyri. You know, it was just, it was revolutionary. It was a game changer. It made commentaries that were current one day obsolete the next, because it radically changed our understanding. It was one of the pivotal events that changed our understanding about biblical Greek. So it was very, very important. And it still is an important set of sources. But as more and more of these come out, it's going to become a much more niche affair, where it's going to become of interest to specialists in particular aspects of the Greek language. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Interesting super chat. Okay. Moises Salazar again for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Dr. Falk, any comment of the Phoenician influence on Israel? And from one engineer to another, what is your favorite programming language? Python, maybe? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I adore Python. Yeah. Python is so easy to program in compared to, say, Perl. Now, I had written a lot of Perl code, did a lot of Perl coding in my career. Now I'm geeking out here. I did C programming, did a little bit of kernel engineering. One of the things is I actually worked on Project Blue Gene at IBM. I developed the boot code to the world, at that time, the world's fastest supercomputer. So, oh yeah, that was... Those were interesting times. Very, very interesting times. And I still do work. I still do it for my own in particular interest, because I find that, you know, having these skills has been very, very useful for Egyptology, especially in, say, the calculation of chronologies. So, yeah, my favorite programming language is Python. Love Python. As I said, incredibly easy to debug. You know, that alone makes it worth it. Okay. Your other question. Now that you got me sidetracked. Any comment of the Phoenician influence on Israel from one engineering to another? Okay. The Phoenicians were sort of up in Lebanon. And, you know, they're actually part of that native Canaanite population that sort of becomes influenced by the migration of the sea peoples coming down through Byblos. Okay, so that's the sort of the origins of the Phoenicians. Now, the question is, did they have much influence on Israel? And that's a sort of yes and no question. They didn't seem to have that much influence in Israel's early history, like during the time of Joshua and the Judges. They don't seem to have much influence there. They seem to have more influence during the divided monarchy period, when the northern kingdom has sort of a trading relationship with Byblos. And it's at that point that, say, there's some cultural interchange between the northern kingdom and the Phoenicians. You know, both of goods and services, but also, you know, trading of members of royal families, foreign wives, that sort of thing. So there is some influence, but it seems to happen during the divided monarchy, maybe as early as Solomon. Because Solomon, you have Solomon starting to work with Tyre and Sidon. He works with, for example, he strikes a treaty with Hiram, king of Tyre. Well, you know, that's a Phoenician port. You know, that's a Phoenician port. So that's going to that definitely has influence on Israel at that time. So we do see that that there is an influence, but it does happen later. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Gizgo Espoel for $2. Thank you very much. Any thoughts of the identity of Kushan Rishathaim? Is that from a Bible verse? Where does that originate from? So again, a little more context might help here. If you want to just throw in a little chat at the bottom where I can see the context on the screen, I can then come back to this one and I can answer that. But I'm going to need a little more context on this. So, okay. Finding Truth for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Support Dr. Falk on Patreon or GoFundMe if you can. Well, thank you. Absolutely. If you can support us on Patreon, that Patreon goes directly into the production of these videos. GoFundMe is going to be used for the production of the book on the plagues of Egypt. It's a universal truth that you do need financing to do research, and it's really, really difficult to do it if you don't have the time. So that's what donating to these programs does, is it gives me the time to do better videos, to do more videos, and to write books. So I appreciate everyone who's donated to Patreon and to the GoFundMe campaign, and it really does help, and it really matters to us. And I thank you all who've donated. Okay, I hear you've answered. Okay. First baddie of the judges. Okay. Cush is the first oppressor in Judges from Aram Naharaim, and is often assumed to be a Mitanni ruler. Oh, that would actually make a lot of sense. Okay. At the time of the Judges, the Mitanni were broken. Okay. But what they did leave behind were Hurrians, the Hivites. And these are the peoples, the basically Mitanni colonists. Okay. Now, where we have here Aram Naharaim, that is where we get, say, Aram is a nation. It's one of the sort of the cousin nations of Israel. Naharaim is the Hebrew word for Mitanni. Okay. So they're giving you that indication that these are Mitanni from Iran. Okay. So essentially, in sort of the Golan Heights, almost into Syria, that region. Okay. So go back to your original super chat. This one here. Okay, there it is. All right. So if that is the case, then we're definitely talking about somebody here who's probably one of the Hurrians. Okay. Now we have to also understand that the Book of Judges is not organized chronologically. It's organized from, say, faithful judges to unfaithful judges, in the same way that the Book of Joshua is organized from faithful tribes to unfaithful tribes or disobedient tribes. Okay. So this is one of those cases where because it would happen so early on in the Book of Judges, that it was probably one of those cases where it was a complete rout, which would not surprise me too much. Let me see if I can look up a little more here. Judges. Hey. All right. I don't quite see it in my Bible here. Otherwise, I'd look it up and read it and give you more analysis. But Judges. Okay, I'm going to do one last search for it, and if I can't find it, I'm going to have to defer further analysis until later. Rishathaim. Found it. Okay, Judges chapter 3. Let's see what we got here in Judges chapter 3. Then, starting verse 8. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and so they sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. I'm reading from the New American Standard here. Basically says Aram Naharaim. So I don't think the NASB has a good translation here. This is basically Aram and Mitanni. And the sons of Israel served Cushan 8 years. And then when the sons of Israel cried out, raised up for deliverer to them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger son. Okay. Yeah, so this is one of the good judges. This is one of the good judges that does deliver them out. So And it's basically, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and when he judged Israel when he went out to war, the Lord gave Cushite-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, into his hand, so he prevailed over Cushite-Rishathaim. Okay, so there's not much I can say about the name Cushite-Rishathaim. There's not we don't have any historical references for him. But the kingdom he comes from, we do. We actually do have a fair lot from Aram, and Naharaim is known to be the Mitanni. So there's that would have definitely been something that would have been historical for the period of the judges. Okay, so that's about all I can say about that for now. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, get back on track here. JD Freeze for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think the sons of Jacob identified their God with a generic high god like El until he identified himself as Yahweh to Moses? Yes, I do. I think it was often called El Shaddai. I think that to be consistent with Exodus 3 without resorting to really weird exegesis, I think you almost have to go with the idea that the Israelites did not know Yahweh prior to Moses bringing that identity back. I think we see this even amongst, say, in the dialogue of the Exodus, where Ramses has no idea who Yahweh is. I mean, Ramses is worshiping gods in Avaris. Oh, he's worshiping Baal. He's worshiping Resheph. He's worshiping Astarte. Yahweh? Who's this Yahweh? I've never heard of Yahweh. That's what he says. And he's worshiping all the others. Okay, so he's worshiping Canaanite gods. And yet he's never heard of Yahweh? Or Yahweh means nothing to him? We have to understand that Egyptians were inclusive polytheists. So if a foreign god comes into Egypt, he just becomes part of the big happy family, the big happy polytheistic family. The only time when that doesn't happen is when the metaphysics of that particular deity are so radically different that it's impossible to accept that foreign god. And that's what happens sort of with Atonism, is the metaphysics precluded it from being accepted ultimately. But I don't think what we had at Avaris and the sons of Jacob was the worship of Yahweh, but the worship of El or El Shaddai. And I think that's perfectly consistent with the biblical texts. So I'm going to go with the biblical texts here, at least as I best understand them. And I know my understanding is not perfect. Nobody's is. So, but that's how I sort of see it at this particular point in time. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Frodo Jack for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did ancient Israel have chattel slavery in any way similar to U.S. chattel slavery? No, it was different. It was different than chattel slavery in the U.S. Slaves in the ancient world were very different than what you find in U.S. slavery. In the ancient world, slaves could earn income aside from what their masters provided. Okay, so a slave could earn income on the side. A slave in the ancient world could own other slaves. In Israel, if an Israelite enslaved another Israelite, he had to be set on free during the 7th year, the Sabbath year. No Israelite could be made to continue slavery beyond that that Sabbath year. Okay. Now that doesn't prevent a slave in Israel from voluntarily becoming a permanent slave. That's sort of what we call the bond servant or bond slave, where the slave decides he doesn't want to leave. You know, and actually there were slaves in the ancient world that made this choice, where they said, you know, yeah, I kind of screwed up my own life and I had a responsibility for myself. Yeah, I don't want to go back to that. I'm doing much better as a slave. You know, I got a wife, I got children, I got other slaves. I'm doing really well as a slave. I think I'll just stay a slave. And they'd be given this gold earring to mark them as a bond slave or bond servant. So it was very, very different kind of slavery than what we find, say, during the chattel slavery of early America. So it's not the same, and it's not even close to the same. But it's still slavery, and still sucks especially if you had a bad master. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Slavery was bad, even back then. But it was different. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. JD3s for $5. Any chance the famine of Ruth could be roughly correlated to the famine of the late Bronze collapse? Yes. But that's because the late Bronze collapse happened over a very long period of time. It wasn't just 1 year. You know, 1177 was a dreadful title for Eric Klein's book. Even he says it was 1184 and the publisher changed it. Well, the fact is that the signs of the late Bronze collapse were starting to happen 200 years before and persisted 200 years after. It wasn't just a light Bronze Age collapse. It was a long period of time. And it's probably what people don't understand about the late Bronze Age collapse. It happened over centuries, not just a year. Okay? So this would definitely have carried over into the time of Judges. And we see with Ruth, the famine of Ruth, where, you know, she's across into the Jordan and, you know, she's married, has 2 kids, kids die, husband dies, they're starving and they have to, you know, go back to Israel. Okay. So I do think that this is part of that late Bronze collapse, but it's not what often people understand the late Bronze collapse to be. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for your super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, we are in overtime and the super chats are still coming. Well, I'll black out if you need to. Okay, Disciple of Christ for $2. Faust versus Petrovich debate when? That was in 2017. Oh, Santi wants to host it. Well, I'm not going to have another furball with him, so I'm not going to do another three-way debate with him where he can sort of hide behind somebody else. So that I'm not going to do. I also don't think he's going to be game for this. He's taken a lot of bloody noses and encounters with me. So I don't think he's going to be agreeable to this anyway. He's not a great debater. Part of it is because he often attacks his own audience. So I don't think he's going to be agreeable to this, even if you know, it was raised. You know, he's made some disparaging remarks to try to prevent to head off a potential debate as well. You know, such as saying that he's a professor, he's a tenure, he's a full professor. What would he do, you know, debating a junior academic? Yeah. Uh, even though I went to school at the same time as him and got my PhD a year before he did, yeah, somehow he's the senior academic. Well, how does one become a professor without going through the tenure process? I'll leave that to your guys' imagination. So, yeah, I don't think that's going to be very likely. Tyler Smith, thank you very much for the super chat for $20. Ooh, asking the real question. Magic the Gathering or D&D, although substantially predating Egyptian civilization, how does Göbekli Tepe and the findings there influence our understanding of later Egyptian and Canaan culture? All right, let's answer the first question. D&D. I was a player of D&D 3rd edition. So I even had at one point the 1st and 2nd edition. You know, the original soft cover. I had a 1st edition soft cover bound D&D rule book, the original Gary Gygax. I don't have it anymore. I wish I still did, because that'd be worth some serious money. But I had one of the original 1st edition of that book. So you know, easy come, easy go. But I was a 3rd edition player. So very much liked D&D. I especially loved playing the Dungeon Master. I loved setting up the whole sort of situations and rules and all that stuff. So yes, that's where I was. I never was into Magic the Gathering. Never got into that. But I was into D&D. I did have all the books. I don't think Göbekli Tepe had much influence on or influences much in a way of our understanding of later Egyptian and Canaanite culture. It's just too early. It's thousands and thousands of years earlier than either Egyptian or Canaanite culture. You know, it long predates the early Bronze Age. So yeah, I don't think there's a strong influence there, if there's any influence at all. I think the influence that we might have from, say, that region at that time might be its agriculture. Because one of the things we do find at Göbekli Tepe is the domestication of certain grains, like chickpeas and barley. Those become domesticated in Turkey and then are basically exported and you know, they spread out all over the place after that. So there is some very important influence, but it's more agricultural than religious. So thank you very much for that super chat. Very generous super chat, and I very much appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay. The Dragon of Mississippi River for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. I did notice that the message was retracted. I don't know what you had said, but I do very much appreciate the contribution. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you have a question underneath? Let's see. I will see if I can scan and find it. No, I don't see it underneath that. I see that also retracted. So, but feel free to put in a question. If you have a question, I'll definitely give it an answer. But thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Oh, I see. Okay, I found the question. Okay. It doesn't retract out of my Twidget. Okay, but it does retract on the YouTube super chat. So we did capture the question. Which Candace of Ethiopia did the eunuch of Acts 8:7 serve under? It is in a confusing lineage. It seems Candace Amatorikiade is the most likely candidate, and I'd probably agree with you there. there was one time I had to look it up, and there is a Candace that is actually consistent with the time frame of Acts 8. But the data behind the Ethiopian lineage is confusing, and that's because there's actually a lot of Candaces. There's 8 of them. Okay, and they all reigned roughly one right after the other, and they weren't terribly long reigns either. So you're absolutely right. This one is confusing, and the Candace that is consistent with the one that we find in Acts 8, we don't have a lot of biography on. I wish we had more, because it is very, very clear that that's who's being referred to. And I think this was a great question, by the way. You know, I think this was actually a really, really good question. So, I don't know if you really didn't think it was a good question, and that's why you retracted it, but you had no reason to be embarrassed with this question. This is a great question. You're absolutely right. The lineage in Ethiopia is confusing. And it even throws me for a loop. So if it throws me for a loop, you know, yeah, you're in good company here. But thank you for the super chat, and I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much. Okay, it looks like we are at the end of the super chats. So I will take 2 non-super chats because I want to be fair. Also, my voice is giving out, so I got to make it at the end soon anyway. I see one here that's just caught my eye. So, why? Where did the curse of the Pharaoh's mythos come from? Jealousy by British newspapers. Okay. That's where it came from. Here's what happened. When Howard Carter discovered the king of King Tut, Tutankhamun, KV62, he kind of had an arrangement with the Times of London to basically allow exclusive access to the tomb, to the discoveries made in the tomb. So this is where, like, Burton published all his photographs. He first published them in like the early 1920s in the Times. Well, there was another newspaper that didn't like this exclusive arrangement. So they wrote this sort of hit piece saying that the tomb was cursed. Really, what it was kind of a way of trying to muscle in on the Times so that they could get some access to the discovery of the century. So that's where the curse of the Pharaoh's myth comes from. Okay, so that's where the modern myth comes from. Okay, but there is spells that are also written on some of these tombs. Now, we don't find them on, say, Tut's tomb, but we do find them on some other Egyptian tombs, where basically there's one tomb that says, if you haven't purified and sanctified yourself and made yourself ritually pure like a priest, that may the gods curse you for your defilement. Okay, so we do find that particular, and it doesn't say curse, it says punish. May the gods punish you for your defilement. Okay, so we do find that inscription. So that's out there, but we don't find a lot of that. It was less common, but the idea wasn't that that people were cursed for entering the tombs, although it was definitely considered to be off limits to go into the inner sanctum. Tombs in ancient Egypt were sort of public and private areas. It had most tombs had a public area where the family and those who wanted to honor the dead could come and visit. But it also had a private area where the dead were buried, and those areas were off limits. So we don't see those curses applied because of that sort of private public status that we find for most tombs in ancient Egypt. So that's the origin of the myth, and thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. And let's see, I'm going to take one from close to the beginning if I can. And this will be the last question of the night because everyone is tired and we've gone very late. I'm actually going to take that one. It's one that was close to the beginning here. Saw that. Yes, there it is. Okay. Disciple of Christ. Actually, you know what? I'm going to unselect that because it's a good question, but I'm going to take somebody else who hasn't gotten a lot of questions in already. Okay, I'll take this one as the last one. Warrior of the Most High. Okay. Question. Hieroglyphics versus cuneiform. Which one appears first in the archaeological record? Well, they appear both at about the same time. You know, and that's what makes this question kind of difficult. Because it sort of seesaws between one or the other, which one is the earliest. Okay? And they appear within about 100 years of each other. Okay? And it depends on who you're going to talk to, which one came first. Whether it's the early cuneiform of, say, Sumer hieroglyphs, which are the predecessor of cuneiform, or if we're talking about, say, the early rebus hieroglyphs that we find on, say, the ivory wine dockets in the pre-dynastic period. So we don't know exactly which one came first because they're so very close together. Okay? They come very, very close together in time. They both hit the archaeological record roughly around 3100 BC, roughly. So that's 3100, 3200, maybe as far back as 3300 BC. But that's when we start seeing both appear in the archaeological record. So anyway, that's going to be the last question of the night. Thank you very much for that question. Very much appreciate a good question. And with that said, we're going to call it a night. Thank you very much for joining us for this late night session. Do let me know in the we'll put up a postmortem and ask how it went, and if you enjoyed this later session, let me know. As you can tell, my voice is giving out because I've had to use it all day, but if you like these later sessions, let me know. And I will see you next week on our next live stream. We do have, again, a release video on Monday, as normal. And I want to thank all our supporters. I want to thank our Patreon supporters, our GoFundMe supporters, and our subscribers. And if you like this channel, please subscribe. It really does help the channel. And with that, good night from ancient Egypt and the Bible, and I'll see you next time.